Hey guys, tonight we're not just telling a story. We will together unveil a secret. The secret of the most powerful king in Europe. A man willing to burn everything down just to get what he wanted. Imagine the mightiest monarch on the continent, possessing everything: wealth, authority, and a vast empire, yet unable to purchase the one thing he craved: a son. That obsession transformed Henry VIII from a brilliant sovereign into a desperate ruler, prepared to defy the church, behead his former wife, and upend an entire kingdom, all for a single desire: an heir. What happens when a king who has everything lacks only one thing? And what lengths will he go to secure it? Would he break every rule, challenge the Roman Church, and commit unspeakable acts just to gain an heir? So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I create here. Now, leave a comment telling me where you are in the world and what time it is there. Dim the lights, perhaps turn on a fan for that gentle background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. You know, all great fairy tales or historical stories have a starting point, and our story is no different. Let's go back in time together, to England in the 16th century, where there lived a great king named Henry VIII. I say great because he literally had everything in the world. He ruled over an empire so powerful that other nations had to respect him. He was the supreme head, believed by his subjects to be blessed by God himself. In short, he was like a superhero of his time. But there was a secret that not everyone knew. Deep inside, this powerful king carried a heavy burden that kept him awake at night. This burden, it wasn't about state affairs or war. It was about family. He was married to Queen Catherine of Aragon, a wonderful woman. But their marriage had gone on for a very, very long time, and they still hadn't produced a healthy male heir to secure the line of succession. For a king, this wasn't just a small issue. This was an extremely, extremely serious problem. It's like building a beautiful, solid house, but forgetting to lay the foundation. The lack of a legitimate male heir could lead to political instability, and even worse, civil war after his death. People started whispering and gossiping. The whispers snaked through the palace hallways, then spread throughout the kingdom. And this very unrest made Henry feel as though he was under siege. Henry wasn't just fighting with his external enemies. He was fighting another kind of war, a war of conscience, duty, and personal desire. He believed that Queen Catherine's inability to bear him a son was a punishment from God. Why, you ask? Because their marriage was a forbidden thing. You see, Catherine had been the wife of his older brother, Arthur. Although they had received permission from the Pope to marry, deep down, Henry believed he had committed a great sin. That belief became a powerful motivation, urging him to seek a solution, a radical change to secure the future of his kingdom. He craved a son to continue his legacy, someone who would bring strength and continuity to the English throne. This hope and craving laid the foundation for one of the greatest and most dramatic stories in history. From a small personal sorrow, Henry created a great storm that changed the fate of an entire nation. That's why, from this point on, our story won't just be about a king. It will be about a man willing to do anything to get what he wants. You know, when we talk about Henry VIII, we can't help but mention the woman who changed his entire life. If Henry was a storm, she was the lightning strike that ignited it all. Our character is Anne Boleyn, an English girl, but her life took a completely unexpected turn. Picture this. After 7 long years living in far-off France, one day, this girl named Anne Boleyn returned to her homeland. But she didn't just come back with a suitcase full of new dresses. She returned with a premium upgrade package. The Anne of today was no longer the Anne of yesterday. Her time in France had transformed her into a completely different woman. Anne had an opportunity that not many people had. She was educated at 2 of the most prestigious courts in Europe. One was the court of Margaret of Austria, who was famous for educating women, and later the French court, a vibrant hub of the Renaissance. From this, we can already see that Anne was anything but ordinary. She learned much more than just courtly dances or aristocratic etiquette. She honed a special art that no school could teach, the art of presence. What does that mean? It means she could command attention and exert powerful influence simply by being there, without having to utter a single word. Just imagine, in a court where everyone talked loudly, a woman could stand still and captivate every eye. Sounds pretty cool, right? And that's not all. The ideas Anne absorbed in France were very, very progressive. She was exposed to new philosophies, streams of thought that dared to challenge the Pope's authority. She also learned about reading the Bible in the common people's native language, rather than just in Latin for the clergy. At that time, these ideas weren't just progressive. They were a revolution. They gave ordinary people an unprecedented spiritual power, helping them make their own religious decisions instead of being dictated by a third party. To us today, this might seem normal, but in the 16th century, it was an incredibly, incredibly bold thing to do. When Anne returned to England, she brought with her a sophisticated French style of dress and a sharp wit in her speech. She astonished the English women, and although they might have mocked her new fashion or her unusual way of speaking at first, their eyes couldn't leave her. Anne understood her own allure. She knew that soon enough, they would envy what they were now making fun of. She was determined to become a woman of great influence, not just a fleeting beauty who would be forgotten. A woman like that, returning to England at the very moment when Henry VIII was craving a change. Don't you think this was destiny? Was the universe setting up everything for these two people to meet and create one of the greatest stories in history? You know, Anne's return was like a new breeze blowing into a court that was far too used to old customs. The English nobles, especially the men, might have initially seen her as a curious toy, a foreign girl with new forms of entertainment. But they were wrong. Anne was not a flower to be admired, but a sharp sword, forged for battle. She had the grace of the French, but carried the decisive spirit of the English. The most terrifying thing about Anne wasn't her beauty, but her intelligence. She didn't just talk about courtly gossip. She spoke about big ideas. About religion, about power, about things that a woman of that era should never touch. This simultaneously attracted and intimidated the gentleman. She challenged every rule, broke every norm, and that's exactly what made her stand out, completely different from every other woman at court. Anne Boleyn brought a new vitality to the English court, a vitality that Henry VIII was desperately craving. King Henry, who was growing weary of the hopelessness of his current marriage, saw in Anne not just a new beauty, but a promise of a brighter future. She wasn't just a woman, she was a symbol of change. And this is a tumultuous love story, not just between a man and a woman, but between a king and a kingdom. The appearance of Anne Boleyn became the catalyst for all the events that followed. Her life, from a girl returning from France to a queen who was beheaded, is a testament that in a world full of power and ambition, a woman can also change history. And Anne's return was just the beginning. We already know that King Henry VIII was a king who craved a son, and Anne Boleyn was an incredibly special woman who had just returned from France. Now, let's find out what happened when these two people met. Things did not start simply at all. Henry VIII began to take notice of Anne Boleyn in the year 1526. But before Henry could make his move on Anne, he had a relationship with her older sister, Mary Boleyn. This relationship had lasted for a few years, and it's possible Mary bore him 1 or 2 children. But when Henry grew tired of her, he discarded Mary without a second thought. And this was a valuable lesson for Anne. She had witnessed firsthand her sister's fate as a cast-off mistress. Anne knew that if she became the king's mistress, she would meet a similar end. For this very reason, Anne made a brave and resolute decision. She would not become Henry's mistress. Despite his flattery, expensive gifts, and grand promises, Anne stood her ground. This rejection from Anne didn't discourage Henry. On the contrary, it only fueled his desire. You see, for a man who had everything, the one thing he couldn't have became more appealing than anything else. Henry wrote many, many love letters to Anne. In these letters, he expressed his deep affection, which was at times childlike, at times passionate. He spoke of being struck by Anne's dart of love. He even sent Anne deer that he had hunted himself, with the hope that when she ate the meat, she would be reminded of him. These letters show just how infatuated Henry was with Anne. He was completely captivated by her intelligence, her sharpness, and her steadfastness. Anne did something no other woman had dared to do. She said no to the king. And that very rejection made Henry willing to do anything to have her. The power struggle and emotional battle between them created an irresistible attraction. On one side was a powerful king who wanted it all. On the other was a brave, intelligent woman who refused to be a mere plaything. Anne was not prepared to sacrifice everything just to be the king's mistress. She only yielded when Henry made the only acceptable offer, a legitimate path, a marriage and a crown. Henry had fallen deeply in love with Anne. He loved her with a passionate, intense love. In his letters, he spoke of his longing to hold her in his arms and to kiss her. Their relationship wasn't just about love. It was a negotiation, a transaction. Henry wanted Anne, and Anne wanted a legitimate position, a crown. In the end, Henry had to do everything to get her. He began the complex and risky process of annulling his marriage to Queen Catherine in order to marry Anne. As you can see, this story is not just a romance. It's a high-stakes game, a gamble where Henry put his entire empire on the line. Anne Boleyn taught Henry a valuable lesson. Love cannot be bought with power. It must be exchanged for respect and a legal promise. And from that point on, Henry did everything to get her. From romantic love letters to bold political decisions, it was all for one woman. You know, after all the flirtation, the romantic letters, and the firm rejection from Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII finally had to face an undeniable truth. The only way to have her was to seek an annulment of his marriage to Queen Catherine of Aragon. It sounds simple, but in reality, it was incredibly complicated. Because, at that time, there was only one person in the world with the authority to do such a thing: the Pope. This was no ordinary divorce. It was a battle of power and faith. And so, Henry decided to place his bet on the person he trusted most: Cardinal Thomas Wolsey. He gave Wolsey an incredibly important mission, a mission whose success or failure would determine the future of the entire kingdom. The task was to go to Rome, meet the Pope, and seek his support to annul Henry's marriage to Catherine. Henry presented an argument that he considered to be perfectly reasonable, a righteous reason based on canon law. He claimed that his marriage to Catherine was invalid from the very beginning, because Catherine had been the wife of his brother, Arthur. According to the Church's law, this was a forbidden relationship. Henry believed that their inability to produce a healthy male heir was the clearest sign of God's punishment for a sinful marriage. Hearing that, you must admit the argument sounds pretty convincing, right? A king who believed in God's will and wanted to correct a wrong to ensure the kingdom's stability. But life isn't a movie. Things were about to take a completely unexpected plot twist. When Wolsey was sent to Rome, he also had to carry another request, a request that sounded like a joke but was, in fact, the truth. Henry wanted to ask the Pope for permission to marry a woman who was closely related to him. Why? Because he had a previous sexual relationship with Anne's sister, Mary Boleyn. And according to the very same canon law that Henry was using to annul his marriage to Catherine, this relationship also created a similar kinship with Anne, making it impossible for them to marry. This shows one thing very clearly. Henry wasn't genuinely concerned about whether his marriage to Catherine was sinful. He was just using it as an excuse, a card to get out of his marriage. In reality, he just wanted to marry Anne Boleyn, who had completely captured his heart and promised a bright future with a male heir. Henry was betting everything on this negotiation. He believed that Wolsey, with his diplomatic talent and influence, would be able to persuade the Pope. He believed this was the only path for him to find happiness and stability for his kingdom. But there was one thing Henry didn't foresee. The world was far more complicated than he thought, and convincing the Pope wouldn't be as easy as he imagined. Everything was set for a no-holds-barred conflict. On one side, a powerful king who wanted an heir, and on the other, the Pope, who was under pressure from other powerful forces. Could Wolsey complete this impossible mission? And what would happen if he failed? All those questions will be answered in the next part. Now, let's close our eyes and wait together. He put all his faith and his kingdom's stability in one man, his closest friend and most powerful minister, Cardinal Thomas Wolsey. Henry was so certain of success that he sent Wolsey to Rome with a deep-seated belief he'd return with a signed annulment in hand, making everything right. But the reality was so much harsher, so much more dramatic. When Wolsey arrived in Rome, he was walking into a situation that was impossible to win. The Pope, a man who supposedly held divine power, didn't have full autonomy. He was essentially a puppet, under the complete control of the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V. And here's where the plot thickens and things get truly complicated. Charles V was the nephew of Queen Catherine of Aragon, the very woman Henry wanted to discard. Can you even imagine? A pope being controlled by the very man whose aunt's marriage he was being asked to annul? Under that immense pressure, with the most powerful ruler in Europe watching his every move, the pope would never, ever agree to grant the annulment. It was simply not going to happen. Wolsey, to his credit, gave it his absolute best shot. He tried every diplomatic trick he knew. He used every persuasive word in his extensive vocabulary. But it was all for nothing. He was in a deadlock, a trap with no way out. The Pope, on the other hand, was a master of delay. He was a seasoned politician, and he knew how to appease a powerful king without actually giving him what he wanted. He offered Henry all sorts of ridiculous proposals to calm him down. At one point, he even suggested that if Henry would just drop the whole annulment thing, the Pope would allow Henry's daughter, Princess Mary, to marry Henry's illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy. I mean, seriously? It sounds insane, right? But this shows just how desperately the Pope wanted to keep Henry from doing something rash. He was willing to do anything to appease him, except for the one thing he actually wanted, the annulment. But Henry wouldn't budge. He wouldn't accept. For Henry, having a legitimate male heir was not an option. It was an absolute necessity for the stability of his kingdom. He wasn't going to settle for a semi-legitimate heir. He wanted Anne, and he wanted a son with her. Henry's decision was crystal clear and completely unchangeable, and Wolsey's failure to secure the annulment had a terrible, terrible consequence: his great downfall. The cardinal, who was once the king's closest confidant, the man who had helped Henry rule his kingdom and built a life of immense power, was now seen as a traitor. Henry could not, and would not, forgive Wolsey for failing him on a mission he believed would bring him ultimate happiness and stability for the kingdom. Henry had trusted him, had entrusted everything to him, only to be met with rejection. And that rejection came not just from the Pope, but, in Henry's mind, indirectly from Wolsey himself. As a result, Wolsey was stripped of everything. His power, his immense wealth, his titles, all of it was taken away by Henry. The once great cardinal was now just a shadow, a ghost of his former self, a symbol of failure. He was forced to return to York, and in the end, he died before he could even be tried for treason. You could say that Wolsey became the ultimate scapegoat for Henry's unfulfilled desires. Wolsey's downfall wasn't just the end of a man's career. It was the end of an era in English politics. But you know what? Wolsey's departure paved the way for a new character, a man who would have a massive influence on Henry's most daring decisions: Thomas Cromwell. Cromwell was incredibly intelligent, sharp, and even more ambitious than Wolsey. He saw what Wolsey couldn't see, that Henry didn't need the Pope at all. Henry just needed a new path. And Cromwell was the man who would literally draw that path, a path that would change the history of England forever. Wolsey's downfall wasn't a failure for Henry. It was a beginning for great changes, for the birth of a new religion, and for one of the most chaotic and dramatic periods in English history. Everything was ready for a revolution. You know, we left off with Henry VIII facing the cold, hard truth. His most trusted minister, Cardinal Wolsey, had failed him. The Pope, a man under the thumb of Queen Catherine's nephew, was never going to grant an annulment. So, what do you do when the traditional path, the one that everyone has followed for centuries, is completely blocked? If you're Henry VIII, you don't just find a new path. You build an entirely new road, and you set it on fire behind you so no one can ever go back. This was Henry's most daring and unprecedented move, fueled by years of frustration and influenced by new, radical ideas, especially those from Anne Boleyn and the reformist scholars she surrounded herself with. Henry decided to do the unthinkable. He decided to break away, completely and irreversibly, from the Roman Catholic Church. This was not a small decision. This was the biggest, most monumental decision of his entire reign. It was like deciding to build a whole new continent just because you couldn't get a building permit on the old one. To get this done, Henry needed the right people on his team. He couldn't trust the old guard, the ones who were still loyal to the Pope. So he brought in a new player, someone who had already shown an openness to reformist thought: Thomas Cranmer. Henry appointed Cranmer as the new Archbishop of Canterbury, a position of immense power within the English Church. This was a direct, unapologetic challenge to papal authority, and Cranmer didn't waste any time. Immediately after his appointment, he did something that would have been unimaginable just a few years earlier. He publicly renounced his oath of loyalty to the Pope. Think about that for a second. The highest-ranking church official in England just told the Pope, "I'm with the king now." It was a monumental act of defiance. Cranmer then went on to declare that the Church of England was now completely independent from Rome, no more following the Pope's rules, no more sending money to the Vatican, and no more listening to what anyone in Italy had to say about English affairs. With Cranmer's help, Henry was now the ultimate boss. The king was declared the supreme head of this brand new Church of England. This wasn't just a religious change. This was a full-blown political revolution. Henry was no longer just the king of a nation. He was the head of his own empire, a self-contained system that did not answer to any outside power, not even the Pope. This was the moment that the foundation of the future British Empire was truly laid. Henry's action essentially said, "I am the emperor of my own domain, and my word is law here." This move concentrated more power in his hands than any English monarch had ever held before. This monumental break from Rome had one immediate, practical purpose. It gave Henry the authority to do what the Pope wouldn't. He could now, on his own, annul his marriage to Catherine. The annulment he had so desperately sought from the Vatican was now a matter of domestic policy. He could simply declare his marriage to Catherine void, and just like that, he was free to marry Anne. This entire, incredible, world-changing series of events was all a means to one end, to secure his love for Anne Boleyn, and of course, the male heir he craved. The consequences of this decision were massive and permanent. It didn't just change the religion of England from Catholic to Protestant. It reshaped the entire political and social structure of the nation. It dissolved monasteries, redirected immense wealth to the crown, and gave the king absolute control over both state and church. Henry's personal drama had become a national revolution, forever altering the course of English history. It was all so dramatic, so full of intrigue, that you can't help but wonder what he was thinking. After many long years of struggle, after Henry VIII had decided to take an irreversible path, all his efforts were finally rewarded. Henry's marriage to Catherine was declared null and void, and the door to happiness with Anne Boleyn was finally open. On the 25th of January, in the year 1533, that was the day that Henry and Anne finally got married. But this wasn't a grand wedding, with millions of well-wishers as we often see in movies. This was a silent marriage, a secret ceremony, with no public witnesses. Perhaps it was because both of them wanted to avoid unnecessary trouble, or maybe they just wanted to keep this important moment to themselves. Even though the wedding was a quiet affair, just 2 months later, Henry decided to hold an incredibly grand coronation for Anne. This coronation was not just a regular ceremony. It was a powerful statement to the entire kingdom and the world. It had to be magnificent, extravagant, even more so than Henry's own coronation. Henry wanted everyone to see and believe that Anne was a legitimate queen, blessed by God himself. He wanted to erase all doubts and whispers about her legitimacy. And there was another extremely important reason for this splendor. Henry wanted to honor the child that Anne was carrying in her womb. For Henry, this baby was not just an ordinary child. It was a prince, the heir he had longed for all these years. This coronation was a declaration to the world that the English throne finally had an heir. Henry did something no king had ever done before. He allowed Anne to wear the ancient Street Edward's crown. This was a symbol of supreme power, reserved only for kings, signifying that the person wearing it was the supreme head of the kingdom. Placing this crown on Anne's head not only confirmed her power, but also demonstrated that she was the woman destined to give birth to sons, securing the stability and continuity of the kingdom. Anne's coronation was not just a symbolic event. It was a strong political message. Henry wanted everyone to see in Anne not only her captivating beauty, but also the future of England, strong and resolute. This was a new era for both Henry and England, an era full of risks, but also full of promises. This event marked a crucial turning point in history. Henry had broken away from the Roman Catholic Church, challenged the Pope's authority, and established a new religion, all for love and the desire for a son. The grandeur of Anne Boleyn's coronation officially closed an old chapter and opened a new, turbulent one for the English kingdom. In September 1533, Anne Boleyn gave birth not to the longed-for prince, but to a vigorous baby girl who was lovingly named Elizabeth. As the midwives wrapped her in soft linen and laid her tiny form in Anne's arms, a hush fell over the chamber. Outside, whispers of disappointment darted through the corridors of Whitehall. A daughter was not the son the realm had cravingly anticipated. Yet, within Henry's weary gaze, there stirred an unexpected glimmer of triumph. He peered at Elizabeth's bright eyes, so full of life and quiet determination, and felt a flicker of pride. In that moment he saw in his daughter the very spark of strength that had once carried him through jousting fields and council chambers alike. Though his courtiers muttered in anxious tones, Henry refused to yield to shame. He swept aside their disheartening murmurs, choosing instead to cradle hope alongside his newborn child. "She is England's shining jewel," he murmured, his voice soft with emotion. Sleep-laden, he imagined Elizabeth one day standing tall at his side, her voice steady and dignified, guiding the kingdom through calmer days. In his heart, he nurtured the comforting belief that time was on their side. Both he and Anne were still in the bloom of life. If Elizabeth could carry the promise of vigour, then surely the fates would grant them another child, a son, to bear the bloodline forward. In the gentle hush of the nursery, Anne pressed her cheek to Elizabeth's, feeling a warmth untainted by the kingdom's clamours. She, too, dared to hope. The years she had spent in foreign courts studying matters of state and faith had tempered her resolve. Now, as she placed a trembling hand on her daughter's tiny chest, she whispered prayers of gratitude and anticipation. Sleep tugged at her eyelids, and she allowed herself a brief reverie in which Elizabeth would grow into a queen whose legacy would outshine all her predecessors. Before the chill of winter had fully lifted, Anne found herself expecting again. In the quiet moments before dawn, she would trace faint lines on her abdomen, recalling the flutter she had felt, a subtle reminder that life once more stirred within her. Henry, with gentleness seldom captured in his public demeanour, would pace the corridor outside her chamber by candlelight, pausing now and then to press a kiss to her trembling hand. Between them, a fragile hope wove itself into the autumn air. This time, perhaps, they would be blessed with a prince. Yet fate can be as quiet and unheralded as a falling leaf. In the late weeks of Anne's pregnancy, a sorrow crept upon them like a gathering mist. One night, in the stillness broken only by Anne's laboured breaths, the cruel truth made itself known. Their child would not live to see the dawn. The midwives, with downcast faces, spoke in hushed tones of what had occurred. Henry, roused from his slumber by the sound of Anne's soft cries, rushed to her side. He found her pale and still, shadows beneath her eyes, as though grief had hollowed out her youthful features overnight. Together, they endured a sorrow deeper than any trial they had faced before. Anne's lament rose and fell in the empty nursery, mingling with Henry's own anguished prayers. The palace corridors, once echoing with the promise of new life, now carried only whispers of divine displeasure. Courtiers exchanged glances heavy with superstition. "Surely," they murmured, "God does not smile upon this union." But within the king's broken voice lay no bitterness toward Anne, only a tender ache that mirrored her own. He gathered her in his arms, whispering apologies that fell away like fragile petals, powerless to soften the edge of their loss. In the weeks that followed, England seemed suspended between grief and expectancy. Anne, frail and quiet, sought solace in prayer and in long hours spent beside Elizabeth's cradle. Henry, unaccustomed to vulnerability, carved out moments of privacy to mourn, his regal bearing undone by sorrow. Yet neither could abandon the duties that bound them to the realm. Council meetings resumed their measured grind. Dispatches still crossed the channel day after day, and the wheel of governance turned relentlessly onward. Still, the memory of Anne's miscarriage lingered, casting a pale shadow over every banquet and council chamber. Henry and Anne both felt the weight of their shared anguish, even as they clung to each other in whispered promises. They would endure, they would strive again, for the sake of their daughter and for the hope that had first drawn them together. And in those quiet, sleep-laden hours, when the world outside softened into darkness, they dared to dream that one day their trials would yield the son they both so fervently desired. 2 years after that heart-wrenching miscarriage, Anne Boleyn found herself again with child. The early months passed in hopeful anticipation, but on a late summer's afternoon, a catastrophe unlike any before descended upon England's court. Henry VIII, ever fond of martial sport, had taken up the lance once more in a joust against a rival noble. Amid cheers and the clang of arms, His mount shied at the last moment. The king plunged forward, his helm striking the ground with such force that he lay unconscious as the horse fell upon him. Servants and knights rushed to his side, lifting the great beast's massive flank from his motionless form. He remained senseless for hours, pale beneath his gilded armour, while rumours of brain injury coursed through the palace like a chill wind. When at last the physicians roused him, Henry's eyes fluttered open to a world transformed. His body ached beyond measure, every breath a labour. They whispered that his mind, once so sharp and keen, bore some hidden damage, an unseen wound that would shadow his thoughts for all his days. Physically weakened, he found the simplest tasks exhausting. The court's revelry grated on his senses. Mentally, he recoiled from the bright gaieties he once adored, retreating instead into long hours of solitude and uneasy reflection. The accident, they said, had altered the very essence of the king. Upon hearing news of her husband's grievous fall, Anne Boleyn was thrown into dire alarm. In the same week that Henry's life hung in the balance, she too would endure a fresh calamity, another miscarriage. This time, the child she bore was a prince, a son whose arrival would have secured her standing and the Tudor succession. But sorrow struck twice. That tiny life, the one ray of hope amid royal peril, slipped away before it could take its first breath. Anne's anguished cries echoed through the corridors of Greenwich Palace, mingling with Henry's own groans of pain. The court fell silent, as if the walls themselves mourned this compounded tragedy. The double blow shattered any remaining illusion of triumph. Henry, still convalescing, felt the weight of dynastic failure more keenly than ever. His marriage to Anne, once radiant with promise, began to fissure under the strain of grief and dread. Where once they had shared quiet confidences in the hush of the nursery, now they exchanged only curt words and half-glances. Anne, her spirit shadowed by loss, retreated behind a stoic facade, her once sparkling wit dulled by sorrow. Henry, burdened by pain and unfulfilled longing, grew distant and harsh, his patience thinning like a candle's flame in a draught. Long silences came to punctuate their days together. In council chambers, courtiers whispered of discontent. In Anne's private chambers, tears stained her cheeks, yet she found no comfort in prayer. Henry's heart, restless and uneasy, began to wander beyond the gallery of his queen. Amid the ladies-in-waiting, one presence shone with gentle grace. Jane Seymour. She moved quietly through the corridors, tending to the king's needs with a soft-spoken devotion that stood in startling contrast to the court's clamour. Jane had declared from the start that she would never stoop to be the king's mistress. Instead, she offered what few in Henry's circle had done of late: true empathy and calm. It was in the twilight hours, when the torches burned low and shadows danced on the panelled walls, that Henry found himself drawn to Jane's side. He would summon her to his bedside under the pretense of seeking comfort for his pain, and she would arrive bearing a cup of warm broth or a gentle touch. In Jane's presence, he felt a serenity denied him, since his accident, an oasis of peace amid turmoil. More than once, he lingered by her chamber door after midnight, listening to her soft breath as she slept. By candlelight, a silent understanding grew between them, woven from shared sympathy and whispered confidences. Before long, Henry courted Jane's favour openly, promising that she would not suffer Anne's fate. He spoke in earnest of marriage, pledging that once his queen was set aside, Jane would wear the crown. To his closest advisers, he confided that Jane's promise of purity and steadfastness gave him hope that his realm might yet be secured by a true son. Those words, spoken in hushed urgency, marked the turning of the tide against Anne Boleyn. From that moment, the Queen's days were numbered, her fall from grace set in motion by the very promise of comfort and continuity that Jane Seymour embodied. Thus began the final chapter in Anne's reign. A king weakened by injury and grief, a queen bereft of heirs and influence, and a gentle lady in waiting poised to step from the shadows into the light of royal favour. In the hush of those autumn nights, the seeds of Anne's undoing were sown, watered by Henry's need for solace, and nourished by Jane's quiet compassion. The court held its breath, awaiting the final act of this tragic drama, as power shifted once more in the chambers of England's troubled sovereign. The strained relationship between Henry and Anne had created a widening chasm, one that schemers and opportunists were quick to exploit. Thomas Cromwell, once the king's most trusted counsellor and secretary, grew increasingly at odds with Anne's vision for the realm. She believed that the vast treasures held by the monasteries should be redistributed to the poor or invested in founding schools and hospitals. But Henry, embittered by his own suffering and desperate for funds to shore up his military campaigns, sided with Cromwell in seeking to enrich the crown and the nobility. Cromwell's ambition meshed perfectly with the king's need. Together they could profit from the dissolution of the monasteries, seizing their gold, silver, and land for the royal coffers. Anne, with her fervent convictions, clashed bitterly with Cromwell. She denounced him during council meetings, accusing him of rapacity and impiety. Her sharp tongue earned her many enemies, and Cromwell, ever pragmatic, recognized that the Queen's influence was now more hindrance than help. He observed how Henry winced at Anne's reproaches, how the king's once-loving gaze had grown cold. Seizing upon this shift, Cromwell devised a plan both ruthless and subtle, aimed at removing Anne from Henry's path once and for all. First, Cromwell cultivated evidence, fabricated letters, coerced testimonies, whispered rumours. He enlisted the feeble musician Mark Smeaton, a gentle soul who had once entertained at Anne's table. Under threat of torture, Smeaton was forced to confess to an illicit affair with the Queen. Cromwell's agents spread the scandal, letting it fester in the taverns and corridors of the palace. Anne's circle began to shrink as courtiers, fearful of association with a disgraced queen, distanced themselves. Those who remained silent were complicit. Those who spoke out found themselves accused of conspiracy. In concert with these machinations, Cromwell orchestrated a broader campaign of accusations. 5 prominent men, some of them Anne's own kinsmen, were arrested on charges of adultery and treason. The charges were absurd on their face. Yet, in the charged atmosphere of suspicion, they took root. Cromwell presented the king with proof, the coerced testimonies of Smeaton and others, plus letters bearing Anne's signature in shaky handwriting that matched her known style. Henry, weary and trusting his secretary's judgment, signed warrants for their arrests and trials. The court watched in stunned silence as the wheels of justice ground inexorably forward. Anne, once beloved, now faced a tribunal stacked against her. Cromwell ensured that her judges were men loyal to him, men who would not hesitate to condemn. When Anne protested her innocence, her words fell on ears closed by political necessity. Even the king, torn between duty and affection, found himself recoiling at the accusations, his heart hardened by months of grief and disappointment. On the morning she was brought to trial, Anne's face was pale, her dark hair undone, hanging in loose waves about her shoulders. She stood in the hall of Westminster, a solitary figure beneath vaulted arches, while Cromwell watched from the shadows, his expression unreadable. The proceedings were swift, far swifter than any true justice could allow. Witnesses recanted, fearing that refusal to comply would mark them as traitors. Anne was denied the full right to cross-examine her accusers or call her own defence. Sleepy-eyed, the judges read out verdicts of adultery, incest, and plotting the king's death, crimes punishable only by death. By the time the sentence was delivered, Anne's knees trembled beneath her, not from fear, but from exhaustion born of months of stress and sorrow. Cromwell's trap had closed perfectly. No rescue was possible. No appeal would be heard. The Queen, once radiant with wit and intelligence, now seemed diminished, a cautionary tale of a woman whose strength had threatened the crown itself. Within days, Anne was confined to the Tower of London, her fate sealed. Henry, encumbered by his broken body and anguished heart, gave a final nod that signified his consent. Cromwell's plan had succeeded beyond measure. The crown's coffers swelled with confiscated monastic wealth, and Cromwell's standing at court reached its zenith. Yet beneath the triumph lay an uneasy silence, for Cromwell and Henry alike sensed that power built on betrayal could prove as fragile as the whispers that had brought down a queen. And so, in the hush that fell over the palace in the days before Anne's end, the realm held its breath. The machinations of a single man had irrevocably altered the course of history. What remained was the echo of what had been a queen's convictions crushed underfoot, and the shadow of Cromwell's cunning ambition stretching long over England's future. At the end of April 1536, a dreadful event set in motion the final unravelling of Anne's world. Under King Henry VIII's sanction, Thomas Cromwell quietly activated the intricate plot he had long contrived. In the dimly lit corridors of Greenwich Palace, a young court musician named Mark Smeaton was seized without warning. Though he had once entertained the Queen with gentle lute melodies, he now found himself dragged before Cromwell's grim instruments of interrogation. In those shadowed chambers, Smeaton endured unthinkable pains, each relentless question pressing him toward false confessions. Sleep-drugged and broken, he finally yielded. He claimed that he had carried on an illicit affair with Queen Anne. That single, tortured admission struck like a thunderbolt. Though Anne herself remained entirely ignorant of Cromwell's machinations, her life was hurled off its axis. The rumour swelled through the corridors of power, poisoning courtiers' whispers and darkening the faces of those who still held loyalty to her. It was a blow from which there would be no recovery. Anne's carefully constructed world, one of ceremony, devotion, and cautious political manoeuvring, crumbled overnight. Just days later, on the 2nd of May, 1536, Anne Boleyn was rudely awakened before dawn. Soldiers of the Royal Guard knocked upon her chambers at Greenwich, their steel breastplates catching the candlelight like cold stars. Anne, heavy-eyed and perplexed, offered no resistance as she was restrained and bound. Clad in her simple linen gown, she was driven through silent streets to the Tower of London. At every turn she cast pleading glances toward familiar landmarks, the chapels, the royal apartments, hoping to discover some sign, however faint, of mercy or explanation. But the faces around her were stone, their lips sealed by Cromwell's decree. Anne knew not the charges laid against her, but two figures understood all too well the depths of the betrayal. Her husband, Henry VIII, who had signed the warrant that felled her, and his chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, the architect of her downfall. Cromwell, ever methodical, had ensured that every accusation would be documented, every testimony coerced. To give a veneer of legality to this savage act, Anne was formally accused of adultery with 5 different men, an allegation so preposterous that only the most fervent haters would believe it. Among those men was her own brother, George, adding the shocking charge of incest to the ever-lengthening list. As if this horror were not enough, Anne was further accused of conspiring to take the king's life, a treasonous offence for which the only punishment was death. Within the cold, moss-covered walls of the tower, Anne was ushered into her cell, an austere chamber, with narrow windows that barely admitted the grey morning light. A single straw pallet lay upon the damp flagstones, and a small wooden stool stood in one corner. Anne's heart pounded against her ribs as she sank onto the straw, the rough fibres biting through her thin shift. Outside her cell door, guards whispered among themselves, casting furtive glances at the chamber's single occupant. The air was thick with the scent of fear and betrayal, the very stones seeming to sigh beneath the weight of her fate. In those hours of isolation, Anne's mind raced. How had it come to this? Only weeks before she had stood at the pinnacle of power, crowned amidst pomp and ceremony. Now she sat alone, accused of the gravest sins and cut off from every ally. A lantern's flicker illuminated the damp walls, and Anne pressed trembling fingers against the rough stone, as though she could will the fortress itself to speak in her defence. She recalled the prayers she had whispered by candlelight, the vows of loyalty she had sworn to the king, and the quiet moments of intimacy they had once shared. All of it felt like a distant dream, slipping away with each echo of her own ragged breath. Despite her desperation, Anne remained proud and composed. She straightened the coarse shift that bound her, lifting her chin so that her dark hair fell in soft waves down her back. Even in this bleakest of hours, she clung to the dignity that had defined her. Deep within, she believed her innocence would shine through, that truth might yet pierce the web of lies spun by Cromwell's agents. But as the muted toll of the tower's bell counted out the passing hours, she felt that hope ebb like a dying tide. In the end, Anne waited in that lonely cell for the summons that would carry her to the Hall of Judgment. Each footstep beyond her door sent her pulse racing. Each muffled voice made her heart ache with dread. Outside, the palace wheeled on, indifferent to her suffering. Courtiers whispered of Cromwell's cunning and the king's resolve. They spoke of the confiscated monastery treasures and the new queen they all presumed would follow. But Anne, imprisoned within those ancient walls, was cut off from every murmur of intrigue. All she possessed now was her own steadfast spirit and the flicker of faith that truth might yet find a way. And so, in the hush of that damp cell, Anne Boleyn waited, awaiting the trial that would seal her fate, the unveiling of accusations cunningly crafted, and the final verdict from a court determined to see her undone. As darkness fell, and the tower sank into silence once more. She closed her eyes, bracing herself for whatever dawn might bring. Anne stood before a tribunal that seemed fashioned to secure her ruin, not to search for justice. The panel of judges who sat in judgment of her were the very men who harboured grudges against her counsel and her reforms. Thomas Cromwell's allies filled the seats of authority, their faces impassive, eyes fixed on the prisoner, with the cold detachment of those who have long ago decided her fate. Queen Catherine of Aragon's kin, who might once have offered Anne sanctuary or support, lay powerless and distant. Henry well understood that Anne lacked a foreign power to defend her now. Without the protection of any royal house or pope, Anne's downfall was rendered all but inevitable. Though the charges against her adultery with 5 gentlemen, incest with her brother George, and plotting the death of her own husband were absurd on their face, the king's will overrode any concern for logic. In the hush of her cell, Anne had composed a letter to Henry, her hand trembling as she penned each word. She implored him for a court that would heed the truth, rather than the lurid gossip of Cromwell's spies. "Let not my honour be sacrificed," she wrote, "where no stain exists. Permit a tribunal of fairness, where my innocence may shine unashamed." She pleaded also for the release of those gentlemen her brother, her old friend Smeaton, and the others who suffered imprisonment on her account. "These men are innocent," she entreated in her letter, "and bear the weight of crime they did not commit. I pray that you, my lord, will temper justice with mercy." But her words, carried on parchment wrapped in the faint scent of lavender, never reached the king's heart. Henry, his spirit hardened by grief and persuaded by Cromwell's cunning, had resolved to free himself from a union that no longer promised a male heir. Anne's pleas fell on ears, deafened by ambition and pragmatic politics. For the sovereign, her execution was no mere punishment. It was a necessity, a chance to clear the path to a fresh marriage and the son he so desperately craved. On the morning of the 19th of May, in the year 1536, Anne was escorted from her cell to the hall of trial. The corridor's torches flickered, casting long shadows as she passed. A hush settled over the assembled courtiers and foreign ambassadors who had come to observe England's royal proceedings. Anne's gait remained steady, her posture unbowed. In her simple shift of white linen and without a crown or train, she embodied both vulnerability and regal dignity. As she stepped before the accused bench, her eyes met the judge's gaze without fear, and her voice soft, gentle, yet unwavering rose clear above the murmur of the court. When she spoke, Anne refused to sully her final hours with false confessions. She addressed the assembled men and women with a quiet grace. "My lords and gentlewomen," she began, "I stand here accused by those I once served with loyalty. I beseech you to consider that no woman can deny her Lord's word and remain unsoiled in heart. I have loved my husband, and in him I saw both king and companion. Though I am found guilty by this tribunal, I proclaim my innocence before God and man." She bowed her head, offering no protestation of guilt. Instead, she invoked her faith and her honour, allowing her silence on the charges to speak louder than any admission of wrongdoing. Henry VIII, seated on his raised dais, watched impassively. In his mind, the Queen's words mattered less than the political necessity of her removal. The sentence was pronounced swiftly, death by decapitation, to be carried out within days. As Anne was led away, her shoulders squared and her gaze front, whispers swept the hall, some of pity, some of relief, some of unspoken admiration for her composure. Her final night in the Tower was spent in prayer and reflection. The hollow clank of the iron grate, closing her cell, echoed like a lament. Anne knelt upon her straw mattress, folding her hands in grateful acknowledgement of the kindness she had once known, and in hope for mercy she did not receive. Sleep eluded her, yet exhaustion claimed her spirit, lulling her into a half-dream where she glimpsed her daughter Elizabeth's laughter and felt the warmth of the sun upon her face. At dawn on the 19th of May, Anne was escorted to Tower Green, where a scaffold draped in black cloth awaited her. The sky hung low, muted by pale clouds that seemed to mourn with silent tears. Anne mounted the steps with a regal calm that astonished onlookers. Her hair, unbraided, fell in soft waves about her shoulders. She turned to the small crowd of observers, bowed her head in reverence, and spoke her last words with a clarity that belied the chill in the air. "I pray you all," she said, "to bear me witness that I die a true Christian, a faithful wife, and a loyal subject. I commend my soul to God, who never deserts the heart that loves him, and I ask, for his mercy's sake, that you will pray for me, that I may find grace in his sight." Her voice, though hushed, carried across the hush of the assembled court. She spoke no word of guilt, no plea for pardon, only gratitude, faith, and a final request for prayers. With extraordinary stillness, Anne knelt and accepted the black blindfold that one lady of her household placed over her eyes. Each breath she took was a soft exhalation, as if easing into sleep. She whispered a final, "Jesus, receive my soul," and awaited the strike that would separate her from this world. In that moment she claimed victory over the falsehoods that had ensnared her. Though her life would end at Cromwell's behest and Henry's decree, her integrity remained unbroken. And so, Anne Boleyn met her fate with the grace of a queen and the calm of one who knows she has done no wrong. As the sword fell, the crowd fell silent, and the chapter of her tragic reign closed, yet her dignity and her plea for justice echoed long after, in the hush that followed and the memories of all who witnessed her final stand. Only 2 weeks after Anne's tragic end, Henry VIII wed Jane Seymour, the lady whose gentle spirit and modest bearing set her apart from both Catherine and Anne. Jane arrived at court in the spring, moving quietly through the corridors with a humble grace that seemed to soothe the king's wounded heart. Her soft voice and patient manner gave Henry a sense of calm he had not felt in many years. Where once he had known turmoil and discord, he now found in Jane a comforting presence that whispered of peace. Henry's hopes rode high upon this new union. For nearly 3 decades, he had sought a son to secure his dynasty, and in Jane, he believed he had found a wife who would grant him that final blessing. Jane's fertility was an open secret among the courtiers. She came from a family known for childbearing, and the king's desire for an heir lent a sacred urgency to their marriage. In the hush of candlelit nights, Henry murmured promises to Jane, his voice soft as a prayer. He spoke of building a future together, of nurturing a child who would carry the Tudor name forward. As the months passed, Jane's condition became plain to all. She moved more slowly through the gardens, pausing to rest beneath the shade of ancient yew trees. Henry accompanied her on long walks, his hand ever at her back, steadying her as they made their way through the palace grounds. The court buzzed with anticipation. Tapestries were woven depicting the Seymour lineage, silken gowns stitched in celebration, and children of the nobility practiced rhymes in praise of the expected prince. On a crisp autumn morning in October 1537, Jane's time came at last. The labour was long and arduous, stretching across 2 days of candlelit effort. Henry, overcome with anxiety, paced the antechamber, drawing comfort from the occasional soft cry that marked each new contraction. Midwives and ladies-in-waiting moved with quiet efficiency, while Anne's old attendants, now survivors of the Queen's downfall, tended Jane with gentle care. Through the hush of the royal nurseries, the new mother's voice rose in a soft, exhausted song of prayer. When at last the child emerged, he was strong and healthy, a rosy-cheeked baby wrapped in fine linens. Henry burst into tears of joy, pressing a trembling kiss upon the infant's brow. He named his son Edward, after his late brother, and proclaimed him the hope of England. In the days that followed, the kingdom erupted in celebration. Bells pealed across London, banners flew from every battlement, and feasts were held in every hall. Courtiers danced in the great halls of Whitehall Palace, toasting the health of the young prince with cups of spiced wine. The birth of Edward seemed to right all wrongs, washing away the memory of sorrow with waves of jubilation. Yet beneath the revelry lay a fragile thread of fear. Childbirth in these times carried grave risk, and as Jane rested in the royal chambers, attendants watched her closely for any sign of trouble. Henry, for his part, remained at her side, his grief at Anne's loss still fresh beneath the surface of his happiness. In candlelit vigils, he prayed for Jane's recovery, whispering pleas to St. Margaret and the Virgin Mary to spare his wife's life. Then, on the 12th day after Edward's birth, tragedy struck once more. Jane was seized by a sudden and fierce fever, puerperal fever they called it, and despite the best efforts of the court physicians, her strength faded rapidly. The palace corridors, which had echoed with laughter and music, fell into an uneasy hush. Henry, summoned to Jane's bedside, found his wife pale and wan. He took her hand and spoke to her in a trembling voice, urging her to fight for their son's sake. Jane, with a gentle smile and a final whisper of devotion, breathed her last. Henry's world collapsed again beneath his feet. In that moment, the king who had built an empire with iron will and unflagging resolve was brought low by sorrow. He withdrew from court life, secluding himself in his private chambers at Hampton Court. The echoes of Jane's laughter and her soft prayers haunted the empty halls. Day after day he sat by her empty bed, surrounded by tokens of her gentle spirit, the little slippers she had worn, the embroidery she had begun for Prince Edward's christening gown. The court tried to carry on, but the sombre pall was unmistakable. The music of triumph gave way to dirges played on the lute, and the bright tapestries of celebration were replaced by draperies of black velvet. Henry, once a figure of regal authority and flamboyant ceremony, now moved like a shadow through his own palace. His features, once robust and commanding, grew gaunt and lined with grief. Advisers spoke in hushed tones of the king's melancholy, of his sleepless nights spent poring over his son's tiny garments, and of the strange remoteness that settled in his eyes. Yet even in his sorrow, Henry recognized that the Tudor line must endure. He appointed a regency council to guide young Edward's upbringing, and to ensure the stability of the realm until the prince reached maturity. The seeds of future conflict, however, took root in the whispering corners of court. With Jane gone, Henry again faced the question of a wife, someone who could comfort him, and perhaps bear another heir. But those decisions lie ahead. In the immediate wake of Jane Seymour's passing, Henry VIII mourned as no king before him had mourned for a bride. He had lost the wife who had fulfilled his most fervent desire, and had found, if only briefly, the solace his troubled heart craved. In the silent watches of the night, he would sometimes whisper her name into the darkness, a final testament to the depth of his love and the fragility of human happiness. The death of Jane Seymour struck Henry VIII as a blow deeper than any he had yet endured. For years, he had toiled through heartbreak and political upheaval in his quest for a son. When at last Jane bore him young Edward, the king's world brightened with the promise of a secure dynasty. Yet the joy was fleeting, and in the pale light of early November, he found himself once more enveloped in sorrow. He had lost the wife he cherished most, the gentle companion whose very presence had soothed the wounds of his earlier marriages. In the days that followed Jane's passing, Henry withdrew from the bustle of court. He sought refuge in the quiet cloisters of Hampton Court Palace, pacing its deserted galleries as though searching for her shadow. The tapestries that once glowed with heraldic symbols now seemed muted under his grief-stricken gaze. He spent long hours alone, his thoughts drifting back to moments of tenderness, the delicate brush of her hand upon his sleeve, her soft voice reciting passages of scripture as they knelt together at dawn, the way her laughter had once echoed through the vaulted halls. Sleep came fitfully, only in brief, dream-flecked intervals. In his heart, Jane Seymour ascended to the highest place among his wives. Where Catherine of Aragon had represented legitimacy and religious devotion, and Anne Boleyn had embodied wit and political fervour, Jane stood for quiet loyalty and selfless devotion. Henry determined that she should never be forgotten. In his final will, he insisted that his own tomb at Windsor should be shared with Jane. When the effigies of the Tudor monarchs were later carved in alabaster, Jane's likeness appeared beside his, her hands folded in prayer, her gaze serene. Portraits commissioned in subsequent years depicted her with a gentle countenance, often cradling the infant Edward in her arms, a tender reminder of her sacrifice. Courtiers whispered that Jane had died so that the kingdom might live, and indeed the realm came to venerate her memory. Anniversaries of her death were observed with solemn masses, and prayers were offered for her soul in chapels across England. Chroniclers wrote of her as a saintly figure, the queen who had given her life for the Tudor line. Even Henry, whose reputation for ruthlessness had been forged in politics and war, seemed to cast aside the hardness of his will when he spoke of Jane. His voice grew hushed and reflective, his manner softened by the pall of mourning. Yet, even in the depth of his affection, Henry VIII remained a monarch of pragmatism. He understood, all too keenly, that the birth of one son could never guarantee the untroubled succession of the Tudor dynasty. He remembered the early death of his elder brother, Arthur, Prince of Wales, how that loss had unsettled the realm and drawn his own path to the throne. The lessons of history weighed heavily upon him. Mortality in the 16th century was capricious, and the security of England demanded more than fragile hopes. A single heir, however beloved, was insufficient to ensure stability. For this reason, even as Henry mourned Jane with a sincerity that astonished his council, he could not linger indefinitely in solitude. Measures were already afoot to seek a new queen. The Regency Council, charged with guiding young Edward's minority, moved discreetly to identify noble families whose daughters might bear the king additional sons. Alliances that had once been out of favour were reconsidered. Marriage negotiations long postponed during Jane's brief tenure resumed under the cautious guidance of Thomas Cromwell, the very man who had orchestrated Anne Boleyn's downfall. Councillors understood that a new marriage would carry both political and dynastic weight. It could strengthen ties with European powers, secure military alliances, and provide fresh blood for the Tudor succession. Henry himself, when he emerged from his private grief, displayed a measured resolve. He visited his son in the royal nursery, lifting the boy into his arms with a tenderness that belied his regal bearing. Then he turned his attention back to the pressing needs of the throne. Ambassadors from Spain, France, and the German principalities were invited to send forward lists of suitable princesses. Daughters of illustrious houses Habsburgs, Valois kin, and others were considered for the honour of becoming England's next queen. Court chaplains wrote treatises on the sanctity of marriage, emphasising that a king's duty to secure heirs outweighed all personal sorrow. In the following months, a hush of expectation settled over the capital. Many believed that Henry's fourth marriage would define the final chapter of his reign. Some hoped for renewed peace with Catholic powers. Others feared that the king might again challenge the Church of Rome. Yet through it all, the memory of Jane Seymour floated like a soft benediction over the proceedings. Even his new mistress candidates were told of Jane's virtues, her humility, her piety, her willingness to sacrifice for posterity. It was whispered that the next queen must embody the same qualities, lest she fail to earn the king's favour or the realm's affection. And so, in the lingering autumn light of 1537, Henry VIII prepared to take another step. His heart still bore the wound of Jane's passing, yet he faced the future with the unyielding determination of a sovereign who understood his duty. The pursuit of heirs drove him onward, even as the image of his beloved Jane remained imprinted upon his memory, a gentle reminder of the price he had paid and the sacrifices still required to secure the Tudor legacy. After 10 years had passed since Jane's untimely departure, King Henry VIII found himself wearied by the passage of time and the weight of his own years. His body, once robust and commanding, had grown frail. Wounds from past jousts and illnesses lingered like unwelcome echoes of former vitality. In the intervening decade, he had entered into 3 more marriages, each union a brief flicker compared to the steady glow he had known with Jane. Yet neither the learned Catherine Parr, nor the gentle Anne of Cleves, nor the fiery Catherine Howard could bridge the chasm left by Jane's absence. None possessed that rare blend of humility and devotion that had soothed his troubled spirit in the days of Edward's infancy. In those final years, Henry withdrew from the bustling pageantry of court, preferring the quiet company of a few trusted confidants. Among these, 2 men stood out above all. William Paget, a steadfast steward whose loyalty had been tempered by decades of service, and Edward Seymour, Jane's own brother, who had guided young Edward's upbringing with a caring hand. By candlelight in his private chambers, Henry would summon Paget to discuss matters of state, his words soft and low as though carried upon a gentle breeze. And sometimes in the hush before dawn, he would call for Seymour's counsel, seeking reassurance that his son's path would be watched over with filial fidelity. During this time, the king undertook a careful revision of his legacy. He set aside the will he had drawn up in earlier days, a document that named a single regent to steer the realm during Edward's minority. No longer did Henry trust one man with such singular power. Instead, he crafted a new testament, a council of equal-ranking nobles and churchmen, each entrusted with the joint authority to protect the young king and preserve the fragile peace of the realm. This council would include Paget, Seymour, and several others whose combined influence would balance ambition with restraint, preventing any single hand from steering England into peril. As the green woods of summer faded into autumn's muted tones, Henry's own strength waned. Fevers seized him with increasing frequency, and his sleep became fitful. When he did slumber, his dreams were haunted by memories of those he had loved and lost. He saw Jane's gentle smile upon the palace steps, heard her soft laughter in the garden at dawn. He recalled the infant Edward cradled in her arms, and the joy that had shone in her eyes. Each recollection brought both comfort and sorrow, like a distant lullaby sung in a foreign tongue. In the early spring of 1547, at the age of 55, Henry's malady overcame him at last. His final days were spent in a hushed chamber at Whitehall, where torchlight cast long, wavering shadows upon the walls. Paget and Seymour remained at his side, holding his hands and offering words of solace even as his breath grew shallow. They read to him from Holy Scripture, passages of hope and promise. And Henry listened with a weary gaze that flickered between hope and resignation. On the 28th of January in the year 1547, Henry VIII drew his last breath. His passing was marked by a profound stillness that settled over the palace and across the kingdom. Curtains were drawn, bells tolled solemnly, and courtiers wept for a sovereign whose reign had shaped England in ways both grand and devastating. News of his death carried swiftly to every corner of the realm, and in every town and village, prayers were offered for the repose of his soul. In accordance with his final injunction, Henry was laid to rest beside Jane Seymour in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle. The alabaster tombs of the royal couple stood side by side, hers, her hands folded in peaceful prayer, his, the effigy clad in regal robes, a gentle expression upon his face. To some, this burial choice spoke of a king's undying love for the wife who had given him his long-sought heir. To others, it seemed a matter of circumstance. Catherine of Aragon had been legally set aside. Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard had met violent ends, and Anne of Cleves and Catherine Parr survived only to remain on distant terms. By the time of his death, Jane and her memory represented the only fitting partner for his final repose. Yet beyond these interpretations lies a more poignant truth. The story of Henry VIII is not merely one of dynastic ambition or matrimonial turmoil. It is, at its core, the tale of a man ever driven by desire. Desire for power, for posterity, and for the fragile comforts of the heart. He had known many loves, many losses, and in the end, it seemed he had but one abiding devotion, to his own imperious will. In each marriage, he sought to fill the void within himself, a void that only he could comprehend, and only he could claim. His final rest beside Jane marked the culmination of a life defined by the restless pursuit of fulfillment, a single, unyielding testament to a man who, in truth, could love no one but himself. As we bring tonight's journey through the tumultuous life of Henry VIII to a close, you may be asking yourself, what can we, in our own fast-paced modern lives, take from a story that unfolded nearly 5 centuries ago? First and foremost, this tale reminds us that the search for power and the thirst for legacy, while perhaps understandable, can come at a tremendous human cost. Henry's relentless pursuit of a male heir drove him to make decisions that devastated families, fractured nations, and ultimately left him isolated in his final days. When we allow obsession, whether with our careers, other people's approval, or even the perfect image of success, to dictate our choices, we risk sacrificing the very relationships and inner peace that make life meaningful. Tonight's video also carries a quieter message about the power of humility and compassion. Think back to Jane Seymour, whose gentle presence brought Henry a fleeting but profound sense of peace. Though her time by the king's side was tragically brief, her legacy endures because she embodied qualities that transcend titles and political maneuvering: grace, empathy, and selfless devotion. In our own lives, we too can strive to be Janes rather than Annes, to offer kindness without expectation, to listen without judgment, and to help others carry their burdens, even when the world seems cold and unforgiving. Moreover, Anne Boleyn's story reminds us of the importance of speaking truth to power, even at great personal risk. Although her final days were marked by betrayal and injustice, Anne never renounced her convictions or her dignity. Today we face our own versions of courts and councils, workplaces, social networks, or institutions where voices can be silenced or distorted. Anne's steadfast refusal to confess to crimes she did not commit encourages us to stand firm in our values, to seek fairness, and to trust that integrity matters more than expedience. But perhaps the most applicable lesson for us now is this: no matter how brilliant or formidable one's public persona may be, we are all vulnerable to loss, regret, and the simple longing for genuine connection. Henry VIII, surrounded by splendor and titled by right of birth, ended his reign yearning for the companionship and acceptance he glimpsed in fleeting moments with Jane. In our own era of endless notifications and curated online identities, we too can forget that behind every screen and every status update is a human being who craves authenticity, understanding, and the quiet assurance that they are valued, not for what they accomplish, but for who they are. So as you ponder Henry's towering castles, his glittering court, and the tragic loves he forged and unmade, ask yourself, how am I pursuing my own crowns? Am I chasing achievements at the expense of my relationships? Do I pause to express gratitude to those who bring warmth and wisdom into my days? And when facing injustice or pressure, do I find the courage to stand up for what I know is right? If tonight's exploration of Tudor intrigue has given you pause to reflect on ambition, loyalty, and the fragile beauty of human bonds, then our time together has borne fruit. May you carry forward these reminders that empathy can be a revolutionary act, that integrity shines brightest in darkness, and that true legacy is measured not by monuments or titles, but by the love and compassion we leave behind. Thank you for joining me on this voyage back to 16th century England. If you're still awake, I wish you a peaceful night's rest. May your dreams be gentler than Henry's wakeful regrets. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you won't miss our next deep dive into history's most compelling stories. Good night, and sleep well.